Well, thank you once again for joining us for our broadcast, our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast. We're going through this section of Scripture in the book of Ephesians. It's talking about relationships, submissive relationships, godly relationships, going back to the home for the most part, husband and wife, children, parents. Beginning with chapter 6, verse 5, he moves to slaves and masters. But as he does that, it should be noted that it was often considered that slaves were part of the household. So when we hear about so-and-so's household, for example, the Philippian jailer in chapter 16 of Acts, that his whole household came to the Lord, that wasn't talking just about his children and his wife. That was probably talking about the slaves that he owned. When we think of slavery, our first thought is of American-style slavery, going back before the Civil War, and what that looked like and all the atrocities that went with that. And certainly there were abuses of slavery in the first century, as there were abuses of all human relationships at times. But the slavery of the first century in the Roman and Greek world was quite different than the slavery that we know today. These slaves were under obligation, but they were also, in many cases, much freer. They were educated. They did all sorts of things that we wouldn't have thought of slaves in our American history of having done. As a matter of fact, slavery was one of the typical ways that people were employed. In reality, as a matter of fact, it was the majority, perhaps, of people of this time were slaves, and it was a vastly superior way to live than being a free person who was a day worker, for example, who had no security, no determination for sure about their future, no assurance that they would have food the next day. Slaves were taken care of. They had food, they had shelter, they had protection, and so many people chose to be slaves on purpose. So the whole world, is what I'm saying, was wrapped around this issue, and many, many people were slaves. So as Paul writes to them, he's not dealing with the slavery issue. He's dealing with how people ought to behave who are in that situation, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. And so our application, the closest thing we have, is employees and employers, although you can't make an exact application, so we have to look at that carefully. But look at what he's telling these slaves to do. If we put this in the realm of employees up to a point, then we see some things that the Lord calls us to do. It says, slaves in verse 5, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. So he's calling for a sincere obedience to those who are over us in the employment world. He says in verse 6, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So we're not simply going through the motions. We're not simply working hard when the boss is around. We're not simply pleasing them in an insincere way, but we're doing it as unto the Lord. Verse 7, with good will render service as to the Lord, not to men. So we keep in mind that we are working ultimately for God, not for people. If that's our attitude in our work relationship, whatever that is, that will radically change our view of how we work. We're not working just for people. We're working for God. Verse 8, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And so he's not promising here that we'll have an easy life if we are good employees, if we follow the instructions of our employer with the right heart, the right attitude. If we work hard, he's not promising that all will go smooth and we'll never have any problems at all. But he does say here that we'll receive back from the Lord something that's good, whatever is good thing each one does, thus he will receive back from the Lord. But that I think he means that the Lord is going to bless us in unique ways as the Lord blesses us. And that kind of blessing is not always with monetary gain. It's not always with the kind of things that we would think we'd want in this world, but it's the blessings that come from God himself. And so there is a very special blessing from God that comes to those who serve in the work world as unto the Lord. Bottom line is those who work for others should be doing it as if they're working for Christ. And that will give us a wonderful day in the Lord and give us a wonderful attitude to serve the Lord and our employer as well. We will finish this section tomorrow.